out! Get out of my house! Get out of my house, now!
Alexander Whitfield's hand slammed against the marble nightstand, and the crystal water glass shattered against the wall. "Get out, all of you, get out of my house." 3 assistants scrambled backward through the bedroom door of his Kensington mansion, and the physician trailing them didn't even try to argue. 41 years old, chairman of Whitfield Maritime Holdings, net worth north of £3 billion, and he was dying by inches, his heart giving out one arrhythmia at a time, and not one person in that house could stand to be in the room with him anymore. Before we get into what happened next, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this story is going to take you somewhere you won't see coming. The diagnosis had come 8 months earlier. Cardiomyopathy, the doctors called it, a heart muscle that had simply decided to stop cooperating. Medication helped. Rest helped, but nothing helped the loneliness that had crept into every corner of that enormous house on Chain Walk, overlooking the Thames, a house built for a family that had scattered the moment things got difficult. His wife had left first, 6 months before the diagnosis actually, though Alexander liked to pretend the timeline was crueler than it was. Margaret had wanted a husband who came home before 9, not a man married to container ships and shipping lanes and quarterly earnings calls. She'd taken the townhouse in Belgravia and half of everything else, and she hadn't called once since the diagnosis. Not once. His business partner, Julian Ashcroft, had been different. Julian came around often, sat by the bed, spoke in a low, careful voice about board resolutions and succession planning and power of attorney, and Alexander had let him, because Julian had been his friend since Cambridge and friends were allowed to worry. What Alexander didn't know, what he wouldn't know for weeks yet, was that Julian's visits weren't about worry at all. "You need someone competent handling the day-to-day," Julian had said just that morning, sitting in the leather chair by the window with a folder of documents balanced on his knee. "The board is asking questions, Alex, about your capacity, about whether you can still make sound decisions given the medication, the fatigue." "I can still read a balance sheet, Julian." "Of course you can. I'm only saying, for your own protection, we should have a temporary management structure in place, just until you're stronger." Alexander had signed nothing that day, but he'd felt something shift in the room, something cold sliding underneath the friendship like a current under still water, and it had left him rattled enough that he'd thrown the glass an hour later at an assistant who'd asked, gently, if he wanted his afternoon tea. If you've ever felt like the people closest to you were only there for what they could get, drop a comment below. I want to hear your story too. The staff didn't last long after that. His housekeeper of 11 years had quit the week before, exhausted by his temper and his silences. The 2 nurses assigned to his morning care rotated out faster than Alexander could learn their names. He'd built, without quite meaning to, a fortress of solitude, staffed by people too afraid or too tired to get close. The one who stayed was a woman named Elise Morrow. She was 32, originally from Lyon, and she'd come to London 9 years ago with a work visa, a single suitcase, and a daughter she hadn't planned for but wouldn't have traded for anything in the world. Elise cleaned the West Wing every morning, moved through the enormous rooms with a quiet efficiency that made her nearly invisible, and never once asked Alexander a personal question. It was, as far as he was concerned, the only acceptable way for staff to behave around him. What he didn't know was that Elise had a 4-year-old daughter named Camille, round-cheeked, dark-eyed, with a mind that moved faster than her mouth could keep up with, and a habit of narrating her own life out loud to anyone within earshot. Camille's nursery had flooded that Tuesday morning. A burst pipe, water pooling across the playroom floor, closed for repairs until further notice. Elise had stood in the staff kitchen with her phone in her hand, doing the arithmetic that mothers without backup do at 6 in the morning, no family in London, a neighbor already at work, an emergency childcare app quoting £40 she didn't have until Friday. She'd made the decision with her hands shaking slightly as she buttoned Camille's coat. She would keep her in the staff quarters. Quiet, contained, invisible. She rehearsed the apology on the bus, murmuring it under her breath while Camille dozed against her shoulder, smelling of lavender shampoo bought in bulk because it was cheaper that way. Camille had other plans. The mansion, to a 4-year-old, was the size of a cathedral. Hallways that curved and doubled back on themselves. A staircase with a banister polished so smooth it begged to be touched. And a door, left slightly ajar, behind which a man lay in an enormous bed staring at the ceiling like he'd forgotten how blinking worked. She pushed the door open with both hands. "You look sad," Camille said. Alexander turned his head, and there in his doorway stood a small girl in a half-buttoned coat, staring at him with an expression that wasn't pity. He knew pity. Pity came with flowers and sympathy cards that said, "Thinking of you," in looping cursive. This was something else entirely, a child simply reporting what she saw. "I'm fine," he said. His voice came out cracked, unused. "Your face says different," Camille answered, and stepped further into the room like she was testing ice, the way children do when they fully intend to cross regardless. "Where did you come from?" "The kitchen part," she said, as if that fully answered the question. Something moved in Alexander's chest that had nothing to do with his heart condition. Small, unexpected, like a window cracked open in a room that had been sealed shut for months. "What's your name?" "Camille, I'm 4. She held up 4 fingers, thumb tucked against her palm. "4," he repeated. "That's what I said." If this story is already giving you chills, smash that like button. It genuinely helps this channel more than you know, and there's a lot more coming. Elise found them 11 minutes later, having searched the West Wing in a silent, rising panic. When she pushed open the door she had never once opened in 9 months of cleaning around it, she stopped cold. Camille was in the armchair by the window, telling Alexander an elaborate story about a stuffed rabbit she'd smuggled in her coat pocket. And Alexander was listening. Actually listening, his head turned toward the child, something unguarded on his face that Elise had never seen there before. "Monsieur Whitfield, I am so sorry, I'll take her right now." "Let her stay." Alexander said, "Please." 4 words and everything changed. The days that followed were strange and tender in a way the house hadn't experienced in years. The nursery stayed closed for repairs 3 days, then 5, then something else entirely, something no one had planned. Alexander told his housekeeper, in a tone that left no room for negotiation, that Camille was welcome. Toys appeared in the sitting room adjacent to his study, ordered without explanation. Camille developed strong opinions about the house. She loved the kitchen, where the chef, a broad-shouldered man named Theo, let her sit on the counter and taught her French words for vegetables she mangled with delight. She loved the garden, where the elderly groundskeeper's dog, a slow spaniel named Bramble, tolerated being dressed in fallen leaves like a costume. And she loved Alexander's room, where, by the 4th day, she'd stopped calling him Mr. Whitfield entirely. "Alex," she'd said the first time, testing the shortened name in her mouth like a new food. And when no one corrected her, not Elise, not the housekeeper, not Alexander himself, it stuck. Every morning around 9:30, she'd knock 3 times, solemn as a judge, and arrive with something. A drawing. A story recited from memory with dramatic hand gestures. A rock from the garden she declared, with total confidence, to be magic. "Why do you keep bringing me things?" Alexander asked one morning, turning a lopsided orange crayon drawing over in his hands. "Because you don't have anything," Camille said simply. "Your room is too empty." He looked around at the room, the tasteful furniture, the original artwork, the medical equipment tucked discreetly in the corner, and understood with a clarity that hurt more than his condition did that she was right. On the bad days, when his heart stumbled and his breath came thin, and his hands trembled too much to hold a book, Camille's presence did something no medication had managed. She didn't fix anything. She simply climbed onto the bed beside him, all elbows and determination, and narrated nature documentaries with more enthusiasm than the narrator himself. "Do you think fish get scared?" she asked once. "I don't know," Alexander admitted. "I've never asked one." "You should, it's rude not to ask." He laughed an actual laugh, rusty and surprised, the first in longer than he could remember. Elise watched all of this from the doorway, grateful and terrified in equal measure. Grateful for the patience being shown to her daughter. Terrified of what would happen when the nursery reopened, of the way Alexander's eyes had started lifting hopefully whenever a small set of footsteps approached his door. She began bringing him coffee herself in the mornings, setting it on the table without a word. On the 5th day he said, "Thank you, Elise." The first time he'd used her name. She kept her back to him a moment longer than necessary before answering, because she needed that moment to steady herself. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to comment your favorite part below. I read every single one, and it helps this video reach more people who need to hear it. But not everyone in Alexander's orbit was pleased by the change. Julian Ashcroft noticed it within 2 weeks. The lighter tone in Alexander's voice on their calls, the way he'd started asking sharper, more focused questions about the very succession documents Julian had been trying to quietly finalize. "You seem better," Julian said one afternoon, seated once again in the leather chair, though his eyes moved across the room toward the crayon drawings now taped along the windowsill with something like distaste. "I am better," Alexander said. "Turns out I didn't need a temporary management structure. I needed people who actually gave a damn." Julian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "About the paperwork we discussed. I've had my solicitor review it, thoroughly." Alexander's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now that hadn't been there in months. "Interesting language in Clause 14, Julian. Very interesting. Almost like it was written to transfer controlling authority the moment 2 physicians sign off on a competency question. Tell me, who selected those physicians?" The silence that followed lasted 4 full seconds, long enough for Alexander to watch something flicker and die behind his old friend's eyes. "I think you're overtired," Julian said finally, standing, gathering his folder. "We'll speak when you're feeling more yourself." "I've never felt more myself in my life," Alexander said quietly. "That's rather the problem for you, isn't it?" After Julian left, Alexander sat very still for a long time, his heart doing its uneven rhythm beneath his ribs, and understood with a cold clarity what had actually been happening in this house for the past 8 months. Not concern, not friendship, a slow, patient siege, waiting for him to be too weak or too isolated to notice the walls closing in. A 4-year-old with uneven pigtails had kept those walls from closing. That evening, when Camille knocked her customary 3 times and pushed into the room, she found him staring at a stack of documents with an expression she didn't recognize. "You have a mad face now," she observed, climbing into the armchair. "Not sad, mad." "Someone tried to take something from me," Alexander said. "Something important." "What did they try to take?" He considered how to explain corporate fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and attempted incapacitation proceedings to a 4-year-old, and settled on, "My company, my life's work." Camille frowned, processing this with the full weight of her 4-year-old reasoning. "Did you tell him no?" "I did." "Good," she said, satisfied, and picked up the remote for the fish documentary as though the matter were entirely resolved. If only it had been that simple. 3 days later, Alexander's solicitor called with news that made the room tilt sideways. Julian hadn't backed down, he'd accelerated. A petition had been quietly filed with a family court judge, supported by 2 physicians Alexander had never personally consulted, alleging diminished capacity due to his cardiac condition and requesting an emergency guardian be appointed over both his person and his company assets. "He's moving fast," the solicitor said over the phone, his voice tight. "There's a hearing scheduled in 9 days. Alexander, I need you to understand, if this goes through, everything, the company, the accounts, even decisions about your own medical care, could be transferred to a court-appointed guardian. Julian's name is on the recommended list." Alexander gripped the phone so hard his knuckles went white. 9 days. 9 days. We need everything we can get. Witnesses to your competency, documentation. Anything that demonstrates you're of sound mind and capable of managing your own affairs. After he hung up, Alexander sat in the silence of his enormous room and, for the first time since the diagnosis, felt something closer to fear than fatigue. This is the part of the story where things get real. If you haven't already, subscribe now so you don't miss how this turns out, because it is not what you're expecting. Elise found him that evening staring at the ceiling exactly as he'd been the morning Camille first found him, and something in her chest twisted at the sight. Monsieur Whitfield, Alexander, she hadn't used his first name before. It slipped out before she could stop it. He turned his head, told her everything: Julian, the guardianship petition, the physicians who'd never examined him, the 9 days standing between him and losing not just his company but potentially his own autonomy. Elise listened, her hands twisting the hem of her apron, and when he finished, she said something that surprised them both. "I have seen him, Julian, in this house at strange hours, twice, going into your study when you were asleep. I thought nothing of it because he is your friend and it is not my place to question your friends." Alexander sat up sharply despite the ache in his chest. "When?" "3 weeks ago, and again last week late past 11. He was on the phone. I heard him say, 'I did not mean to listen, but the door was open,' he said. 'The physicians are prepared to sign whatever we need as long as the timeline holds.'" Alexander felt the floor of his understanding shift beneath him. "Would you say that in front of a judge?" Elise hesitated. Testifying against a powerful man in a country not fully her own, with an immigration status that still felt fragile some days no matter how many years had passed, was not a small thing to ask. "They could make trouble for me," she said quietly. "For my papers, for my job." "I would never let that happen," Alexander said. "I swear to you, Elise, whatever it takes." "I know," she said, and the way she said it, steady and certain, told him she'd already decided. "I will tell them what I heard. Camille deserves better than a world where people like Julian win because everyone else was too frightened to speak." Over the following 9 days, the house transformed into something between a hospital ward and a war room. Alexander's solicitor brought in specialists who documented, hour by hour, his lucidity, his memory, his sharp and entirely intact capacity for complex reasoning. The housekeeper testified to his sound judgment in managing household affairs. Theo the chef spoke of detailed, precise menu discussions Alexander held with him weekly. Even Thomas the groundskeeper had an account of a recent, entirely rational conversation about drainage systems in the garden. But it was Camille, unknowingly, who gave Alexander the thing he needed most, not evidence, but resolve. Each morning she still knocked 3 times and climbed into the armchair with her stories and her rocks and her fierce, uncomplicated loyalty, entirely unaware that a small war was being fought around her to keep the house, and the man in it, intact. "Why do you look so tired again?" she asked on the 7th day. "Someone is trying to prove I can't take care of myself," Alexander said, too exhausted to filter the truth from a child anymore. Camille considered this with enormous seriousness. "That's stupid," she declared. "You take care of me every day. You know all the fish names now." "That's not quite the same thing as running a shipping company, sweetheart." "It's the same thing as being smart," she said, with the absolute, uncomplicated logic of a 4-year-old, and went back to arranging her rock collection on the windowsill. He didn't sleep well that night, running through everything the court would ask, everything Julian's lawyers would twist. But somewhere in the small hours, staring at the ceiling, he found a strange and steady calm settle over him. He had spent 8 months believing he had nothing left worth fighting for. He'd been wrong. We're getting close to the twist now. If you want to see exactly how this plays out, tap that subscribe button so you catch part of the reveal you won't want to miss. The hearing took place in a quiet courtroom in central London, 9 days after the petition was filed. Julian arrived with his legal team, composed and confident, clearly expecting the matter to be a formality. He had not expected Elise Morrow to take the stand. She spoke clearly, in careful, precise English, describing the conversation she'd overheard, the dates, the exact words Julian had used about physicians prepared to sign whatever was needed. Julian's solicitor objected repeatedly, but the judge, a sharp-eyed woman named Justice Whitmore, allowed the testimony to stand, noting that a household employee's first-hand account carried significant weight. Then came the true and unexpected turn. Alexander's solicitor produced financial records, quietly subpoenaed over the previous week, showing payments from a shell company, traced, after considerable effort, back to Julian Ashcroft, to both physicians who had signed the original competency complaint. Neither doctor, it turned out, had ever actually examined Alexander in person. The courtroom went very still. Justice Whitmore turned her gaze on Julian with an expression that could have frozen the Thames. "Mr. Ashcroft, would you care to explain why 2 physicians you paid, personally, provided sworn medical opinions on a man neither of them examined?" Julian's composure finally cracked. These are unrelated consulting fees, Your Honor, I fail to see." "I think you see quite clearly," the judge said. "This petition is dismissed in its entirety. Furthermore, I'm referring this matter to the Crown Prosecution Service for review of potential fraud and conspiracy charges. Mr. Whitfield, you're free to go, with the court's apologies for the ordeal you've been put through." Alexander sat very still for a long moment, feeling something enormous loosen in his chest. Not just relief, but vindication, the first genuine breath he'd taken in what felt like years. Outside the courthouse, Julian caught up to him on the steps, his composure fully gone now, replaced by something desperate and ugly. "You have no idea what you've just done," he hissed. 20 years of friendship, Alex, and you'd throw me to the wolves over some maid's testimony." "Some maid," Alexander repeated, and something cold entered his voice. "Her name is Elise, and you didn't lose our friendship over her testimony, Julian. You lost it the moment you decided my illness was an opportunity instead of a tragedy." He turned and walked away, and for the first time in 8 months, his legs didn't feel like they belonged to someone else. We are almost at the ending now. And it's a good one. If this story has moved you even a little, hit like and subscribe before we get there. It truly makes a difference for this channel. The weeks that followed brought quiet, steady changes to the house on Chain Walk. Julian resigned from the board before the fraud investigation could reach its conclusion, and criminal charges followed within the month. Alexander's cardiologist, upon actual examination, confirmed what Alexander had begun to suspect on his own, that with proper treatment and considerably less stress, his prognosis was far better than the manufactured crisis had implied. But the most significant change had nothing to do with boardrooms or court dates. On a quiet Sunday evening in late autumn, Alexander asked Elise to sit down in his study. Papers were laid across the desk, not legal threats this time, but something else entirely. An education trust established in Camille's name, generous beyond anything Elise could have imagined. A revised employment arrangement that no longer resembled employment at all, full partnership in a charitable foundation Alexander was establishing, one focused on supporting single mothers navigating immigration and childcare systems, exactly as difficult as the one Elise had fought through alone for years. Why? Eliza asked, her voice unsteady, her hands pressed flat against her knees. Because your daughter walked into my room when no one else would, Alexander said. Because you told the truth in that courtroom when it would have been so much easier and so much safer to stay silent. Because somewhere in the last 2 months, I stopped being a man people managed and started being a man people actually cared about. And I don't think either of you fully understand what that's worth to someone who thought he'd lost it forever. Eliza's eyes filled, and this time she let them. Camille would say you're being silly, she said, laughing through the tears. She would say it's obvious. You take care of the people who take care of you. She's usually right about these things. She usually is. Outside the study door, small footsteps approached, and 3 familiar knocks sounded against the wood, solemn as ever. "Come in, sweetheart," Alexander called. Camille pushed the door open, a new drawing clutched in her hand, 3 figures this time, holding hands beneath a lopsided yellow sun. "It's us," she announced, presenting it with the gravity of a masterpiece unveiling. "I made it today at nursery. Theo says the colors are magnifique." Alexander took the drawing and set it beside the purple flower that had never left his desk, and something settled in his chest that felt, for the first time in a very long while, like peace. "It's perfect," he said. "I know," Camille said, entirely unsurprised, and climbed into his lap the way she had 100 times now, small and certain and utterly unaware of the war she had quietly helped win simply by refusing, on one ordinary Tuesday morning, to leave a sad man alone in an empty room. Sometimes the people who save us don't announce themselves with grand gestures. Sometimes they knock 3 times, climb into an armchair too big for them, and simply refuse to leave. And sometimes that's exactly enough to change everything. If this story meant something to you, make sure you're subscribed, drop a like, and tell us in the comments which moment hit you hardest, and stay tuned, because there's another story coming very soon that you won't want to miss.